What if every insect vanished overnight? The answer is terrifying. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and noticing something strange. No mosquitoes, no flies, no ants crawling across the sidewalk, no bees moving between flowers, no butterflies, no beetles, no crickets, no insects anywhere. At first, this might sound like good news. No mosquito bites, no cockroaches in the kitchen, no wasps around your food, no insects destroying crops. For a few hours, people might even celebrate. But then scientists realize what has happened. Every insect on Earth has vanished overnight. And suddenly, the question is not whether life becomes more comfortable. The question is how long our ecosystems can keep functioning without them, because insects are doing jobs most of us never notice. And the first major problem would begin with plants. A huge number of flowering plants depend on animals to move pollen from one flower to another. Bees do it. Butterflies do it. Moths do it. Flies do it. Beetles do it. Without those pollinators, many plants can still survive for a while. The trees do not fall over tomorrow morning. Flowers do not instantly disappear. But reproduction becomes much harder for many species. And that means the next generation of plants becomes the real problem. Think about an apple orchard. The trees already standing there remain alive. But if their flowers are not properly pollinated, fruit production can collapse. The same problem affects many fruits, vegetables, nuts, and other crops. So what would humans do? Our first response would probably be to protect agriculture. Farmers could use hand pollination for some high-value crops. Workers might transfer pollen manually. Machines could potentially help. Greenhouses could use controlled pollination systems. But now we hit the problem that appears again and again in this scenario. Scale. It is one thing to hand pollinate a greenhouse. It is another thing to replace trillions of insects working across farms, forests, grasslands, and wild ecosystems every day. We could protect some crops. We could not replace everything insects do. Fortunately, not all food disappears. Crops such as wheat, rice, and corn are mostly pollinated by wind rather than insects. That means humanity would still have major sources of calories. So this is not a scenario where every supermarket becomes empty the next morning, but our diets would change dramatically. Many fruits would become harder to produce. Some vegetables would become more expensive. Certain nuts could become scarce. Foods that depend heavily on insect pollination would require expensive artificial assistance. The supermarket might still contain bread and rice, but the produce section could eventually look very different. And agriculture is only the beginning. Now we reach problem number 2, animals. Insects are food. Birds eat them. Bats eat them. Frogs eat them. Fish eat insects and insect larvae. Reptiles eat them. Small mammals eat them. And those animals are eaten by larger animals. Remove insects, and you have suddenly removed a massive amount of food from ecosystems around the world. Imagine a bird that feeds its chicks insects. The insects disappear. The parent bird now has to find another food source. Maybe it succeeds, maybe it doesn't. Now imagine this happening to millions of animals at the same time. Some species could adapt, others might decline rapidly. And once insect-eating animals begin disappearing, predators that depend on those animals face the same problem. This is how an ecological disturbance moves through a food web. It does not stop with the thing that disappeared, it spreads. But now something even stranger starts happening on the ground. Dead leaves fall from trees. Animals produce waste. Plants die. Wood rots. Normally, enormous communities of organisms help break this material down. Fungi and bacteria do much of the chemical decomposition. But insects and other small animals also play major roles in breaking, moving, shredding, and recycling organic material. Without insects, decomposition does not simply stop. but the recycling system changes dramatically. Dead plant material could accumulate differently. Animal waste would take longer to break down in some environments. Nutrients would move through ecosystems differently. And one of the most important systems on Earth, the recycling of dead material back into usable nutrients, would become less efficient. Now consider soil. Healthy soil is not just dirt, it is an ecosystem. Insects tunnel through it. They move organic material. They influence microorganisms. They help break down dead matter. Their tunnels can change how air and water move through the ground. Take those animals away, and soil ecosystems begin changing. Farmers can compensate with fertilizers and machinery, but forests do not have tractors. Grasslands do not have fertilizer trucks. Wild ecosystems would have to reorganize themselves without one of their largest groups of animals. And this leads to a surprising question. Would humans actually starve? Not immediately. Humanity is extremely adaptable. We could change what we grow. We could prioritize crops that do not depend heavily on insect pollination. Rice, wheat, corn, other staple foods. Governments could protect seed supplies. Agricultural scientists could expand indoor farming. Artificial pollination could protect valuable crops. Food systems could become more controlled. But there is another problem. Livestock, cattle, chickens, pigs, and other farm animals also depend indirectly on functioning agricultural systems. If feed crops become harder or more expensive to produce, meat production becomes more expensive too. So once again, the smartest survival strategy would be efficiency. Grow foods that provide large amounts of calories using relatively little land and energy. Reduce food waste. Protect pollination-dependent crops where artificial methods make sense, and redesign agriculture around the species that can still reproduce without insects. But then there is something most people would probably notice much faster. No insects means no honey. Honeybees are gone. Commercial beekeeping disappears overnight. And the loss is much bigger than honey. Beekeepers transport colonies to agricultural regions specifically to help pollinate crops. That service disappears too. Humans would have to replace not just wild pollinators, but an agricultural industry built around managed insects. Could robots replace bees? Possibly in limited situations. Small robotic pollinators could potentially move pollen between flowers. Automated greenhouse systems could help. Drones might assist in some crops, but once again, scale becomes the enemy. A bee is tiny. It feeds itself. It navigates. It detects flowers. It reproduces. It works without charging cables. And nature produces enormous numbers of them. Building machines that replicate that activity across entire landscapes would be extraordinarily expensive. So instead of replacing every insect with a robot, humanity would probably redesign agriculture to require less insect assistance. Now we reach another unexpected consequence. Some diseases could decline. Mosquito-borne diseases would lose their insect vectors. Certain parasites and pathogens that depend on insects for transmission could be disrupted. Crop pests would disappear. Termites would disappear. Locust swarms would disappear. From a human perspective, some immediate changes would actually be beneficial, but this is where the scenario becomes deceptive. Removing something harmful does not mean removing the entire group is helpful. Mosquitoes may annoy us, but insects as a whole perform countless ecological functions. It would be like fixing a broken light in your house by cutting electricity to the entire city. You solved one problem and created hundreds more. So what happens after 1 month? Many adult plants are still alive. Major staple crops may still be available. Humans are reorganizing agriculture, but wildlife begins responding. Insect-eating animals are under pressure. Pollination-dependent plants have produced fewer seeds or fruits. Some food chains are beginning to weaken. After 1 year, the changes become much easier to see. Some plant populations reproduce poorly. Bird populations decline in certain ecosystems. Animals that depended strongly on insects have difficulty recovering. Food prices change. Agriculture becomes more industrialized. Artificial pollination expands. Governments prioritize staple crops. And habitats that once sounded alive at night become strangely quiet. No crickets, no buzzing, no moths around lights, no fireflies. Entire sounds disappear from nature. Then the problem reaches forests. A forest may look stable because its trees can live for decades or centuries, but forests also depend on reproduction. Flowers need pollination. Seeds need to form. Young plants need to replace old ones. Remove important pollinators, and the consequences can take years to become obvious. And that is what makes this disaster dangerous. Some parts of the collapse would be slow. You might look outside after 6 months and think everything survived. The trees are still there. The grass is still green, but an ecosystem can be failing long before it looks dead. The missing generation is the warning. No new seeds, no young plants, fewer birds, fewer frogs, less food moving through the system. The collapse begins quietly. So what would our survival plan actually look like? First, protect global food reserves. We would need time to redesign agriculture. Second, immediately identify which crops depend most heavily on insect pollination. Those crops would receive artificial pollination where practical. Third, expand wind-pollinated and self-pollinating crops. Staple foods become the foundation of the food system. Fourth, protect soil health. Without insect activity, farmers would need to rely more heavily on managed composting, soil monitoring, microbial systems, crop rotation, and other techniques to maintain fertility. Fifth, prepare for ecosystem disruption. Wildlife conservation would become extremely difficult because you cannot simply feed every bird, frog, fish, and bat on Earth. Scientists would have to identify which ecosystems are collapsing fastest and determine whether any interventions could keep critical species alive. And sixth, develop replacement technologies, mechanical pollination, indoor agriculture, controlled decomposition, artificial habitats, advanced food production, possibly even cultured foods and microbial proteins. Humanity could compensate for some lost insect functions, but probably never all of them. And that reveals something important. Insects are small enough to ignore. That may be why we underestimate them. A whale looks important. A lion looks important. A forest looks important. An insect disappears beneath your shoe and seems insignificant. But there are insects almost everywhere, and collectively, they connect enormous parts of Earth's biological system. They pollinate, they recycle, they become food, they influence soil, they move nutrients, they shape ecosystems. And they do all of this largely without humans noticing. So would every human die if insects vanished tomorrow? Probably not. Human civilization has technology, agriculture, stored food, scientific knowledge, and the ability to adapt. But the natural world supporting civilization would undergo enormous disruption. Food would become less diverse. Agriculture would become more expensive. Wildlife populations would change. Plant reproduction would decline in many species. And ecosystems could enter cascading collapses that would be extremely difficult to reverse. The terrifying part is not that insects disappearing would destroy Earth overnight. It is almost the opposite. At first, everything might look normal. No mosquitoes, no flies, no buzzing. For one beautiful, quiet morning, some people might think the world had improved. Then flowers stop becoming fruit. Birds stop returning. Food webs begin breaking. Soil begins changing. Forest stop replacing themselves properly, and humanity realizes that some of the smallest creatures on Earth were holding together systems far larger than themselves. The lesson is simple. Sometimes the most important parts of a system are the parts we barely notice. And if every insect vanished overnight, we might spend the rest of our lives discovering just how much work they were doing for us.